In the spring of 1944, British General Bernard Montgomery sat in his headquarters reviewing intelligence reports about the upcoming invasion of France. The operation, codenamed Overlord, would be the largest amphibious assault in history, and Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces for the initial phase. He was studying the American divisions that would assault Omaha Beach, one of 5 landing beaches along the Normandy coast. Montgomery was a seasoned commander who had defeated Rommel in North Africa and led British forces through Sicily and Italy. He had strong opinions about military competence, and his opinions about American troops were not favorable. In conversations with his British staff officers, Montgomery expressed concerns. The Americans, he said, were enthusiastic but lacked the discipline and battle-hardened experience of British forces. They had performed adequately in North Africa and Italy, but those campaigns had revealed weaknesses in American training and command. Now they would face the German Atlantic Wall, fortifications that Hitler had spent years perfecting. Montgomery worried that American units might break when they encountered heavy resistance. Montgomery wasn't alone in his skepticism about American military capabilities. British military culture in 1944 reflected centuries of professional military tradition. The British Army saw itself as an elite force, disciplined and competent, heir to victories at Waterloo and 100 other historic battles. American military expansion during the war had been rapid, taking the U.S. Army from about 200,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by 1944. This explosive growth meant that most American soldiers were recently inducted civilians with minimal training compared to British professional soldiers. British officers observing American training camps saw informality that looked like indiscipline to eyes accustomed to rigid military hierarchy. American soldiers called officers by first names in some units, maintained less formal bearing, and seemed more concerned with comfort than military precision. To British observers, this suggested an army that wasn't serious, that hadn't fully committed to military professionalism. The early American combat performance in North Africa had reinforced these British prejudices. When American forces first engaged German units in Tunisia in early 1943, the results were embarrassing. At the Kasserine Pass, German forces under Rommel attacked inexperienced American units and drove them back in disorder, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing significant amounts of equipment. British forces had to counterattack to stabilize the situation. British commanders and soldiers drew conclusions from Kasserine. Americans were brave enough, but poorly trained and badly led. They made basic tactical mistakes that British units had learned to avoid years earlier. American equipment was good, American logistics were excellent, but American combat effectiveness was questionable. The American performance improved through the North Africa campaign and into Sicily and Italy. American forces learned from their mistakes, adapted their tactics, and began fighting more effectively. But British observers still saw problems. American commanders sometimes seemed too cautious, other times too aggressive. American soldiers didn't always follow doctrine. American units took higher casualties than British forces in comparable situations, suggesting inferior tactical skill. The Americans had potential, British officers acknowledged, but they needed more seasoning, more experience, more time to develop into truly competent forces. The problem was that D-Day couldn't wait for American forces to fully mature. The invasion had to happen in 1944, and American forces would have to perform whether they were ready or not. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was himself American, which created tensions in the command structure. British officers, including Montgomery, sometimes questioned whether Eisenhower had been chosen for military competence or for political reasons to ensure American support for the campaign. Eisenhower's easygoing management style contrasted sharply with Montgomery's strict control, and British officers sometimes interpreted American informality as lack of seriousness. The alliance between Britain and America was essential and generally functional, but it was not without friction. British forces had been fighting since 1939, had survived the Blitz, had held out alone against Hitler when the rest of Europe had fallen. Americans had entered the war late, after Pearl Harbor forced their hand, and British soldiers sometimes resented that Americans acted like they were going to win the war when British had been fighting and dying for years. The plan for D-Day assigned different beaches to different national forces. British and Canadian forces would assault Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches on the eastern end of the invasion front. American forces would take Utah and Omaha beaches to the west. The beach assignments reflected geography and operational planning rather than any judgment about relative capability. But the beaches themselves varied significantly in how heavily they were defended. Utah Beach, at the western end of the invasion front, was relatively lightly defended. Omaha Beach, however, was a different story entirely. Intelligence indicated that Omaha was defended by experienced German troops occupying well-prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire, minefields, obstacles, and fortifications. The beach itself was a killing ground, with cliffs and bluffs providing German defenders with commanding positions overlooking the landing areas. American commanders preparing for Omaha Beach understood they faced a difficult mission. The plan called for extensive naval and aerial bombardment before the landing to suppress German defenses, followed by specialized armor, including amphibious tanks to provide fire support for infantry coming ashore. If everything worked as planned, American forces would establish a beachhead quickly and push inland. But experienced officers knew that plans rarely survived contact with the enemy, and Omaha Beach offered very little margin for error. The terrain favored defenders heavily. There were only a few exits from the beach, meaning that forces landing would be channeled into predictable routes that German defenders could cover with machine guns and artillery. If the preliminary bombardment failed to suppress German defenses, or if the supporting armor didn't make it ashore, the infantry assault waves would face a nightmare. The American soldiers training in England for D-Day were mostly young, many still teenagers. They came from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, small towns in Texas, and neighborhoods in New York. Most had been civilians just a year or two earlier. They had received basic training, specialized training for their roles, and unit training to develop cohesion. But training, no matter how realistic, couldn't fully prepare them for the experience of combat. These young men knew they were preparing for something big. Security was tight, but it was obvious that a major operation was coming. They wrote letters home that their families would receive later, knowing that some of them wouldn't survive whatever was coming. They checked and rechecked equipment, tried to rest, made jokes to deal with fear, and waited for orders that would send them into battle. British soldiers preparing for Gold and Sword beaches were in similar situations, also training and waiting, also writing letters home, also dealing with pre-combat nerves. But British soldiers had the confidence that came from experience and from belonging to an organization that had proven itself. Many British units landing in Normandy included veterans who had fought in North Africa or Italy and knew they could handle combat. American units had fewer veterans and less confidence. Some American soldiers probably heard rumors that British commanders doubted American capabilities, and this added pressure to an already stressful situation. They would have to prove themselves, not just to the enemy, but to their allies. The weather in early June 1944 was terrible, with storms that threatened to delay the invasion. Eisenhower made the gutsy decision to proceed despite marginal weather, because further delay meant missing the optimal tide and moon conditions for weeks. On the evening of June 5th, the invasion fleet sailed, thousands of ships carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers, toward the French coast. The men scheduled to land at Omaha Beach boarded their landing craft in darkness and rough seas, many becoming seasick during the hours-long approach to the beach. They were cold, wet, miserable, and scared. Some vomited, others prayed. Most simply endured and waited for whatever would happen when their landing craft reached the beach. The preliminary bombardment of Omaha Beach that was supposed to suppress German defenses largely failed. Naval gunfire fell short or overshot the German positions. Heavy bombers attacking through clouds dropped their bombs too far inland, missing the beach defenses entirely. The specialized armor that was supposed to support the infantry had catastrophic problems. Most of the amphibious tanks launched offshore sank in rough seas before reaching the beach, drowning their crews. The rocket-armed landing craft that was supposed to saturate the beach with fire malfunctioned or launched inaccurately. The elaborate plan for supporting the infantry assault collapsed before the first soldier reached the beach. The German defenders, veterans of the 352nd Infantry Division who had been moved to Omaha Beach recently and whose presence American intelligence had missed, survived the bombardment in their bunkers and dugouts, and prepared to fight. The first waves of American infantry hit Omaha Beach at approximately 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944. The landing craft dropped their ramps and soldiers rushed into water that was deeper than expected, some men going under completely with the weight of their equipment. German machine guns opened fire immediately. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar of gunfire mixed with explosions from artillery and mortars. Men were hit before they reached the beach, falling into the water and disappearing. Others made it to the sand and tried to find cover behind the beach obstacles that German engineers had installed, steel barriers and wooden stakes designed to rip open landing craft. There was almost no cover. The beach was a wide-open killing ground with German gunners firing down from positions on the bluffs that the bombardment had failed to destroy. Within minutes, Omaha Beach was a scene of carnage unlike anything American forces had experienced in the war. Bodies lay in the surf and on the sand. Wounded men cried for medics who were themselves pinned down or dead. Equipment burned. Landing craft that had been hit drifted or sank. Officers and sergeants who tried to organize their men were priority targets for German marksmen. The plan, the careful coordination, the phased approach to securing the beach, all of it dissolved into chaos and death. Some units that landed at Omaha Beach took 70 or 80% casualties in the first hour. Entire boat teams were wiped out, 30 men killed or wounded before they could even organize to fight. The survivors huddled behind whatever minimal cover they could find, pinned down by fire so intense that movement seemed suicidal. Back on the command ships offshore, senior officers monitoring radio reports realized something was going very wrong at Omaha Beach. The other beaches were reporting progress. Utah Beach to the west had landed in the wrong location by accident, but found light opposition and was moving inland successfully. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches were encountering resistance but making progress according to plan. But at Omaha, the reports were fragmentary and desperate. Units were pinned down, casualties were heavy, progress was minimal. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, considered the possibility that the Omaha Beach assault had failed, that he might need to evacuate survivors and redirect follow-on forces to other beaches. It was the worst-case scenario, the outcome planners had feared, but hoped would never happen. On the beach itself, American soldiers faced a choice. They could stay where they were, pinned down but relatively safe behind whatever cover they had found, and wait for someone to figure out what to do. Or they could move forward into the fire and try to accomplish the mission. Many chose to stay down. No one could blame them. Moving meant almost certain death. The German defenses had perfect fields of fire covering every approach. But gradually, in small groups and as individuals, American soldiers began moving. A sergeant would get his men organized and lead them forward. An officer would rally whoever would follow and head toward a German position. Individual soldiers, acting on their own initiative without orders, would start crawling forward through the sand. There was no coordinated plan anymore, no careful choreography. Just small groups of men deciding that staying pinned down was unacceptable and that they had to move forward even if it killed them. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, a fortified position between Utah and Omaha beaches, accomplished one of D-Day's most remarkable feats. Their mission was to scale 100-foot cliffs under fire to destroy German artillery that threatened both American beaches. They landed under heavy fire, set up rope ladders and climbing equipment, and began scaling the cliffs while German defenders shot at them and threw grenades down. It should have been impossible. The cliffs were nearly vertical, the defenders had every advantage, and the Rangers were completely exposed during the climb. But they made it to the top, fought through German positions, and discovered that the heavy guns they had come to destroy had been moved inland. So they went inland under fire, found the guns, and destroyed them with thermite grenades. Then they held their position for 2 days against German counterattacks, taking heavy casualties but refusing to give up the ground they had taken. Of the roughly 225 Rangers who landed at Pointe du Hoc, only 90 could still fight by the time they were relieved. Back on Omaha Beach, the breakthrough came not from any single coordinated effort, but from dozens of small unit actions that gradually overwhelmed German defenses. Bangalore torpedoes were used to blow gaps in barbed wire. Engineers braved fire to clear obstacles and mark safe paths. Infantry squads worked their way up the bluffs using any cover they could find, then attacked German positions from angles the defenders hadn't fully covered. Destroyers from the naval force, seeing the desperate situation on the beach, came in dangerously close to shore and fired directly at German bunkers, taking risks with running aground that would normally have been unacceptable. Their gunfire, directed by observers on the beach, finally began suppressing some of the German strongpoints that had made the beach such a killing ground. By mid-morning, small groups of American soldiers had reached the top of the bluffs in several locations. They were disorganized, intermixed from different units, low on ammunition, and exhausted. But they were off the beach and in position to attack German defenses from behind. The German defenders, who had been slaughtering Americans on the beach all morning, now found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't expected. The complex of trenches, bunkers, and firing positions that had made Omaha Beach so deadly was designed to fire outward at the beach, not to defend against attackers who had gotten inland. American soldiers, despite having no coordinated plan and despite having lost most of their officers and NCOs, began clearing German positions through close combat, using grenades, rifles, and desperate courage. The battle for Omaha Beach continued through the day, with American forces gradually expanding their foothold and pushing inland. Follow-on waves landed through the afternoon, adding fresh troops to the fight and bringing supplies and equipment. By evening, the beachhead was secure though shallow, and American forces controlled enough ground to ensure the landing wouldn't be thrown back into the sea. But the cost had been staggering. Approximately 2,400 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing from Omaha Beach on D-Day. Bodies lay in the surf and on the sand. The beach was littered with destroyed equipment, burning vehicles, and abandoned gear. Medics worked frantically to treat wounded men and evacuate them to ships offshore. The survivors, many of them still teenagers, had aged years in a single day. British commanders who visited Omaha Beach in the days after D-Day were shocked by what they saw. The extent of the carnage was far beyond what British forces had experienced on their beaches. The German defenses at Omaha had been stronger than at Gold, Juno, or Sword, and the American assault plan had fallen apart, leaving infantry to succeed through raw courage rather than through the careful coordination that military planning was supposed to provide. British officers who had questioned American competence found themselves reassessing. The American performance at Omaha Beach hadn't been tactically elegant. It had been bloody and chaotic. But American soldiers had accomplished what some British planners had thought impossible. They had taken the most heavily defended beach in Normandy, despite facing the worst conditions, despite losing most of their support assets, despite casualties that would have broken less determined forces. General Montgomery, who had expressed private doubts about American fighting quality, said little publicly about Omaha Beach. But his attitude toward American forces changed after Normandy. He had watched American soldiers prove that courage and determination could overcome tactical disadvantages and firepower disparities. He had seen American units suffer casualties that British professional soldiers would have considered unacceptable and then continue fighting. Montgomery would continue to have conflicts with American commanders throughout the remainder of the war, disagreements about strategy and operations that sometimes became bitter. But he stopped questioning whether American soldiers could fight. Omaha Beach had settled that question definitively. The soldiers who survived Omaha Beach carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Many couldn't talk about it for years afterward. The memories were too painful, too traumatic. They remembered friends who had died beside them on the beach. They remembered the noise, the chaos, the feeling of complete helplessness under fire. They remembered making the decision to move forward even though it seemed like suicide. Some felt guilt that they had survived when so many hadn't. Others felt pride that they had done their duty despite the cost. Most felt both. The men who took Omaha Beach were, in many cases, the same soldiers British commanders had dismissed as undisciplined amateurs just weeks earlier. They had proven themselves in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The Bedford Boys from Bedford, Virginia, represented the kind of sacrifice small American communities made on D-Day. Bedford was a town of about 3,000 people, and Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment drew heavily from the area. 35 men from Bedford were in the company that landed at Omaha Beach in the first wave. 19 of them died on June 6th. 3 more died later in the campaign. In a single day, a small Virginia town lost a significant portion of its young male population. Almost everyone in Bedford knew someone who had died at Omaha Beach. The National D-Day Memorial was later built in Bedford, recognizing the town's sacrifice and honoring all who fought in Normandy. The Bedford Boys' story was repeated in small towns across America. Communities that sent their young men to war and suffered losses that devastated their social fabric. The American Cemetery at Normandy, established on a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach, became one of the most visited and most moving war memorials in the world. Row after row of white crosses and stars of David mark the graves of over 9,000 Americans who died in the Normandy campaign. Many of the men buried there died on June 6th on the beach below. The cemetery is maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, kept immaculate as a tribute to the fallen. Visitors from around the world come to walk among the graves and contemplate the sacrifice. For older Americans, especially veterans and family members of those who fought in World War II, visiting the cemetery is often an overwhelming emotional experience. They see the names, read the ages, understand that most of these men were barely adults. The cemetery represents not just military history, but human cost. Young lives ended before they had really begun. President Ronald Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day in 1984 captured the meaning of what happened at Omaha Beach for Americans of the World War II generation. Reagan stood on the cliffs that Rangers had scaled under fire and spoke about the men who had accomplished that feat. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," he said. "These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The speech resonated because it honored specific people who had done specific things. Men who were old by 1984, but who had been young on June 6, 1944. Some of those Rangers were in the audience listening to Reagan speak, remembering what they had done 40 years earlier, remembering friends who hadn't survived. The speech and the ceremony acknowledged that their sacrifice had mattered, that it was remembered, that it would not be forgotten. The British military establishment's respect for American forces solidified after the breakout from Normandy. American units that had struggled at Omaha Beach went on to fight across France with increasing competence and confidence. The American Third Army, under General George Patton, moved with speed and aggression that impressed even skeptical British observers. American logistics, the ability to keep forces supplied and equipped as they advanced rapidly across France, was beyond anything British forces could match. American industrial production meant that American units always had adequate ammunition, fuel, and equipment, luxuries that British forces operating on tighter margins often lacked. By the time Allied forces reached Germany itself, the American Army was the dominant Allied ground force in Western Europe, larger than British and Canadian forces combined, and increasingly sophisticated in its operations. General Eisenhower's elevation to permanent supreme command of Allied forces represented American ascendancy in the alliance. Montgomery remained a senior British commander, but no longer had operational authority over American forces except in specific circumstances. The command structure reflected the reality that American forces constituted the majority of Allied strength, and that American resources sustained the campaign. British forces remained highly competent and continued fighting effectively, but the alliance had evolved from one where Britain was the senior partner and America the junior, to one where America increasingly set strategy and Britain, while valued, was the smaller contributor. This shift reflected not just numbers, but also the validation that American forces had earned through their performance in combat. The tactical lessons learned from Omaha Beach influenced American military doctrine for decades. The importance of reconnaissance and accurate intelligence was driven home by the surprise presence of the 352nd Infantry Division, whose location had not been identified before the landing. The need for effective preliminary bombardment was obvious given how little damage the naval and air attacks had inflicted on German defenses. The vulnerability of specialized armor was demonstrated by the loss of so many amphibious tanks to rough seas. Future amphibious operations incorporated these lessons with more thorough intelligence preparation, more effective naval gunfire coordination, and better planning for armor support. The Marine Corps campaigns in the Pacific benefited from Normandy lessons, and American planning for potential amphibious operations during the Cold War reflected what had been learned on Omaha Beach. The individual acts of heroism at Omaha Beach were too numerous to fully document. The medics who ran through fire to reach wounded men, exposing themselves repeatedly to save lives. The engineers who cleared obstacles and mines while under direct fire, knowing one mistake would kill them. The junior officers and sergeants who rallied their men and led them forward when senior leaders had been killed. The Navy personnel who brought landing craft back to the beach again and again, despite seeing previous waves slaughtered. The destroyer captains who risked their ships by coming close to shore to provide fire support. Every man who moved forward on Omaha Beach, despite having every reason to stay frozen in place, showed courage that most people will never have to demonstrate. Some received medals, but most went unrecognized except by the men who fought beside them. The German defenders of Omaha Beach also deserve acknowledgement for their perspective on the battle. They had been placed in defensive positions and told to hold against invasion. When American forces landed, German soldiers did their duty and fought with skill and determination. They inflicted terrible casualties on attackers who were exposed and vulnerable, but they were also eventually overwhelmed by American determination and numbers. German soldiers who survived the battle and were captured reported being astonished at American persistence. They had destroyed wave after wave of attackers, seen the beach covered with American dead and wounded, expected the assault to stop. But Americans kept coming, kept attacking, kept moving forward despite casualties that should have broken any unit. This relentlessness, the refusal to quit regardless of cost, made a deep impression on German defenders who had thought themselves safe behind their fortifications. The question of whether the Omaha Beach assault should have been called off was debated then and has been debated by historians since. General Bradley seriously considered evacuation during the morning when reports indicated the landing had failed. If he had given that order, if American forces had been withdrawn from Omaha Beach, the entire D-Day operation would have been compromised. The gap between Utah Beach and the British beaches would have remained in German hands, making coordination between American and British forces difficult and leaving German forces a seam to exploit. The decision to continue the assault, to keep sending men into what looked like a death trap, was made partly because there was no good alternative and partly because reports from the beach, though grim, indicated that some progress was being made. That decision cost thousands of American lives, but ultimately proved correct. The comparisons between casualties at different beaches became part of the historical narrative but requires context. Gold Beach, assaulted by British forces, saw approximately 400 casualties on D-Day. Juno Beach, taken by Canadian forces, had roughly 960 casualties. Sword Beach, another British objective, had about 680 casualties. Utah Beach, the American landing to the west, had remarkably light casualties of about 200 because the accidental landing in the wrong location put American forces opposite weak German defenses. Omaha Beach had over 2,400 casualties. The stark disparity wasn't due to British or Canadian forces being better fighters or American forces being worse. It was due to Omaha Beach being far more heavily defended and the American assault plan falling apart, leaving infantry without the support they needed. But the numbers did establish that American forces had faced and overcome the most difficult challenge of D-Day. The relationship between American and British forces remained complex throughout the remainder of the war in Europe. There was genuine mutual respect at the working level, where soldiers from both nations fought side by side and developed friendships and camaraderie. At the command level, there were ongoing tensions between American and British generals about strategy, resources, and credit for victories. Montgomery in particular remained difficult, often claiming credit for successes that involved American forces and sometimes being dismissive of American commanders. But even Montgomery acknowledged, at least privately, that American forces by late 1944 were as competent as any forces in Europe. The condescension that had characterized some British attitudes toward Americans early in the war became untenable after Omaha Beach and the subsequent American performance across France. The home front impact of D-Day in America was profound. Families across the country knew that the invasion had been launched and that their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers were involved. The first casualty reports began arriving within days, but many families wouldn't know for weeks whether their loved ones had survived. The telegrams from the War Department informing families of casualties were dreaded. Gold stars appeared in windows across America, signifying that the household had lost someone in the war. In Bedford, Virginia, the telegram deliveries began arriving on June 12th, and the small community was devastated as family after family learned their boys weren't coming home. This pattern repeated in towns and cities across America. The cost of victory measured in lives that would never be lived and families that would never be complete. The veterans who survived Omaha Beach returned home after the war to communities that honored their service but couldn't fully understand what they had experienced. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it was like to run into machine gun fire on a beach in France? How do you describe watching your friends die around you while you somehow survived? Most veterans didn't try. They came home, tried to resume normal lives, got jobs, married, raised families, and tried to leave the war behind. Some succeeded better than others. Many carried physical wounds that never fully healed. Almost all carried psychological scars, though in that era they didn't talk about post-traumatic stress or seek counseling. They just lived with the memories and tried to move forward. The annual D-Day anniversaries became important commemorations for veterans and their families. Every June 6th, ceremonies were held at the Normandy American Cemetery and at monuments across the United States. Veterans groups gathered, often traveling to Normandy to visit the beaches where they had fought. As the years passed and the veteran population aged, these commemorations took on additional poignancy. The men who had been teenagers on Omaha Beach were old men by the 1990s and 2000s. They were grandfathers and great-grandfathers, retired from careers, some dealing with health problems. But when they returned to Normandy and walked on Omaha Beach, they remembered being young, remembered being scared, remembered being brave. The beach itself, peaceful and beautiful on a summer day, bore little resemblance to the hell it had been on June 6, 1944. The French communities in Normandy maintained deep gratitude to the Americans who had liberated them. Towns throughout the region hosted memorials and museums dedicated to preserving the memory of D-Day and the Battle for Normandy. French civilians who had been children in 1944 remembered American soldiers sharing chocolate and chewing gum, remembered the noise of battle, remembered the relief when German occupation ended. These French citizens understood that their liberation had cost thousands of American lives. Every year on June 6th, French families placed flowers on American graves, attended memorial ceremonies, and thanked aging veterans who returned to visit. This gratitude, passed down through generations, ensured that American sacrifice was remembered and honored in the communities that had been liberated. The strategic significance of D-Day extended far beyond the immediate military objective of establishing a beachhead in France. The successful invasion opened a second front that Germany had desperately feared. German forces that might have reinforced the Eastern Front against Soviet advances were tied down in France fighting Americans and British. German resources that might have been used for war production were diverted to defending occupied territory. The psychological impact on Germany was enormous, the understanding that they were now fighting a two-front war they could not win. For the occupied peoples of Europe, D-Day represented hope that liberation was coming. For Americans at home, it demonstrated that their military, despite British skepticism and early setbacks, could accomplish complex operations against determined opposition. The equipment left on Omaha Beach in the days after D-Day represented millions of dollars of destroyed or abandoned material. Burned-out vehicles, damaged landing craft, destroyed tanks, and scattered equipment littered the sand. Recovery teams worked for weeks clearing the beach and salvaging what could be salvaged. The human cost was measured in the casualty lists and in the bodies that washed ashore for days after the battle. Graves registration units had the grim task of identifying American dead, preparing them for burial, and recording information so families could eventually be notified. This work was emotionally devastating for the soldiers who performed it, handling the bodies of young men who had died violent deaths. But it was essential work, giving the fallen the dignity of proper burial and ensuring families received confirmation of their loss. The stories of individual soldiers from Omaha Beach emerged over the years through memoirs, interviews, and historical research. There was the young lieutenant who led his platoon up the bluff despite being wounded 3 times, refusing medical treatment until his men were off the beach. There was the radio man who maintained communications while under fire, calling in naval gunfire that suppressed German positions. There was the medic who treated over 30 wounded men in the first hours of the battle, working without rest until he collapsed from exhaustion. There was the engineer who cleared beach obstacles while German machine guns fired at him, saving lives by opening paths through the defenses. Each of these stories represented individual courage under circumstances that tested human limits. The tactical innovations forced by the chaos at Omaha Beach influenced American military thinking about leadership and initiative. Traditional military doctrine emphasized following orders and maintaining unit cohesion. Omaha Beach demonstrated that when plans collapse and communications break down, victory depends on individuals and small groups taking initiative without waiting for orders. The sergeants who organized whoever was near them and led attacks on German positions weren't following a plan. They were improvising, using their training and judgment to accomplish the mission, despite circumstances that bore no resemblance to what had been expected. This validation of initiative and adaptability became embedded in American military culture, influencing training and doctrine for subsequent generations. The families of those who died at Omaha Beach faced grief that lasted lifetimes. Parents who lost sons struggled with the knowledge that their children had died before really living, had never married, never had careers, never experienced the normal joys of adult life. Siblings who lost brothers grew up in households shadowed by absence. Wives who lost husbands raised children alone, keeping memory alive but unable to fully share their loss with children who had never known their fathers. The phrase, "the greatest generation," applied not just to those who served, but to their families who supported them, waited for them, grieved for them, and carried on despite devastating losses. The military cemeteries scattered across Europe and the Pacific represented American sacrifice in tangible form. The Normandy American Cemetery was the most visited, but there were others in Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Each cemetery was maintained immaculately, a promise that sacrifice would not be forgotten. American veterans visiting these cemeteries decades after the war often broke down emotionally, remembering friends whose names they found on the white crosses. For their children and grandchildren, walking through these cemeteries provided connection to history and family heritage. The graves represented not just abstract history, but actual people, someone's father or grandfather, someone's brother or uncle, real men who had lived and died. The debate about whether the enormous casualties at Omaha Beach could have been avoided through better planning continued among military historians. Better intelligence would have identified the 352nd Infantry Division's presence and allowed better preparation. More effective naval and air bombardment might have suppressed German defenses. Landing in different locations or at different times might have reduced casualties. But all of these suggestions involved hindsight. The commanders planning D-Day made decisions based on the information they had and the constraints they faced. The weather forced timing choices. The tide required specific landing times. Intelligence was incomplete because gathering information about heavily defended territory was inherently difficult. The bombardment plan reflected what was believed possible given weather and accuracy limitations. Perfect planning was impossible, and the imperfect planning that actually existed led to success despite the terrible cost. The German perspective on Omaha Beach fighting included respect for American determination mixed with their own perspective on the battle's outcome. German soldiers who fought at Omaha Beach and survived generally acknowledged that American forces had shown remarkable courage. The willingness to keep attacking despite horrendous casualties impressed German defenders who had expected the assault to falter. But German survivors also noted that their own forces had been outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed by superior American resources. They had inflicted heavy casualties, but couldn't stop the landing because American forces had been too numerous and too persistent. This German assessment, while self-serving in some ways, contained truth. American victory at Omaha Beach resulted from both courage and material superiority, from soldiers who kept fighting despite casualties, and from a nation that could replace losses and sustain operations. The technological lessons from Omaha Beach extended beyond tactics to equipment and weapons. The failure of many amphibious tanks highlighted the need for better designs that could handle rough seas. The difficulties infantry faced crossing the beach under fire led to development of better suppression weapons and supporting arms for amphibious assaults. The communication problems that left units disorganized led to improvements in radio equipment and procedures. Every aspect of the Omaha Beach assault was studied, analyzed, and used to improve American amphibious capabilities. These improvements benefited Pacific campaigns where Marines conducted numerous amphibious assaults. And they influenced American military preparation throughout the Cold War when potential conflicts with the Soviet Union might have required amphibious operations in Europe. The cultural impact of D-Day on American society was lasting and profound. D-Day became a touchstone in American memory, a moment when American courage and sacrifice were undeniable. Films, books, and documentaries about D-Day were produced for decades, each generation retelling the story and finding meaning in it. The 1998 film Saving Private Ryan brought D-Day to new audiences, with its graphic opening sequence depicting the Omaha Beach landing, introducing younger Americans to what their grandfathers had experienced. Veterans who saw the film often said it was the most realistic depiction of combat they had witnessed, that it captured the chaos, violence, and fear that no previous film had managed to convey. The film sparked renewed interest in World War II history and inspired many people to thank veterans while they were still alive. The political use of D-Day memory sometimes created tensions between historical accuracy and patriotic narrative. Politicians invoked D-Day to support various policies, claiming that contemporary challenges required the same courage and sacrifice that had been shown in Normandy. Veterans sometimes objected to these comparisons, feeling that their specific experiences were being appropriated for purposes they might not support. The memory of D-Day belonged to the men who had fought there, but it also belonged to a nation that needed heroes and wanted to honor sacrifice. Balancing these different claims on D-Day memory required sensitivity to veteran perspectives while acknowledging the broader cultural significance of the event. The educational programs built around D-Day history helped ensure younger generations understood what had happened and why it mattered. School curricula included D-Day in their coverage of World War II. Museums and memorial sites offered educational programs for students. Oral history projects recorded veteran testimonies before the generation passed away. These efforts served multiple purposes: honoring veterans, preserving history, and transmitting values about courage, sacrifice, and service. Teachers using D-Day as a teaching tool emphasized not just the military history but the human dimensions, helping students understand that the soldiers at Omaha Beach had been young people not much older than the students themselves. The final veterans of Omaha Beach, men now in their late 90s, or few remaining who reached 100, represented living links to history. Their presence at commemorative ceremonies added authenticity and emotional weight. When they spoke about their experiences, audiences listened with reverence and gratitude. These men had become national treasures, embodiments of values and experiences that younger generations had not known. The recognition they received late in life, the respect and honor shown to them, perhaps helped compensate for decades when their service was taken for granted, or when they felt their sacrifices were not fully appreciated. The British commanders who had questioned American soldiers before D-Day never publicly admitted their error, but their actions spoke clearly. After Omaha Beach, British military leaders treated American forces as equals and respected American combat effectiveness. Montgomery remained difficult and sometimes dismissive, but even he could not deny what American soldiers had accomplished. The broader British population developed genuine appreciation for American forces and for the sacrifices Americans made in liberating Europe. The special relationship between Britain and the United States, while sometimes strained, rested partly on the shared experience of World War II and on British recognition that American intervention had been essential to Allied victory. The legacy of Omaha Beach lives on in American military culture and national identity. The beach represents a moment when American soldiers faced the ultimate test and passed it. They were not better equipped than the enemy. They were not fighting from defensive positions. They had no inherent advantage except courage and determination. British generals had called them undisciplined amateurs, questioned their ability to handle sustained combat, doubted whether they belonged on the same battlefield with professional British soldiers. Omaha Beach answered those questions definitively and permanently. The young Americans who stormed that beach, who died on the sand or who survived to fight inland, proved that American soldiers could face any challenge, overcome any obstacle, and accomplish any mission when their nation and freedom demanded it. That is why Omaha Beach matters to Americans decades later, why the story is retold to each new generation, and why the sacrifice of June 6, 1944 will never be forgotten.